Hey, First Baptist, hope you're doing well. I want to share with you a couple thoughts today that I've been thinking about really over a lot of this last year. I want to kind of use Hebrews 11 and 12 as a springboard for that. If you're familiar with Hebrews 11, it's this recounting of so many Old Testament saints that walked by faith. And when the author of Hebrews speaks of that, he's speaking of the reality that they didn't get what they were promised yet, but they kept walking ahead. They didn't get heaven on earth. Instead, they were looking forward to a heavenly city. They believed God exists. They believed that he would reward them, and they kept following him their entire lives, even when that wasn't realized on this earth and in this life. And really, much of this is directing the readers of Hebrews and us towards this idea of endurance. And I think we need that right now. It is easy to get very caught up in how things are going in our world and feel like things are, incredibly important, earth-shakingly, eternally important. And there are things that are. But we can get out of whack and we can begin to feel like things are so difficult that we cannot bear it. And I think backing up and getting some perspective is helpful. So I encourage you to read through Hebrews 11. Think about it from the perspective of the people experiencing it, right? There's this one section where it talks about some of the triumphs. They shut the mouths of lions and they put foreign armies to flight. And then it turns the corner and says something along the lines of, and some were sawn in two. Some were beaten. Some were cast out, right? And that comes along with following Christ. And I think of Hebrews 12, where he kind of brings home the application of this. Listen to what the author of Hebrews says. It says, "Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and the sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of God." I think that idea of endurance is key, and we need that right now. We're going to keep following Christ no matter what. He's worth it. Let's endure. And as we think about this idea of gaining perspective, I think looking at biblical history is helpful. Looking at church history is helpful. Like, you look down through the centuries, and Christians have died for Scripture, for the gospel, over and over again. You see these periods of persecution, and we can read these stories of people who no one else was following Christ, and they stood firm, and they stood firm for the gospel. And so I think that historical perspective is helpful. But even today, I think a geographical or global perspective is really helpful for us. To think about the believer in sub-Saharan Africa, impoverished, perhaps persecuted, following Christ. To think about the believer in the slums of a South American city that is continuing to love his church and continuing to follow Jesus, even though life is incredibly difficult. Or a believer in China or Afghanistan that they're undergoing, that are almost constantly in fear for their lives. That gives us perspective. And I want to just recommend a resource that I read, a book that I read this last year that I found helpful for this. It's called A Company of Heroes by a guy named Tim Keese. I think that's how you say his name. Maybe Kesey, I'm not sure. But A Company of Heroes by Tim Keese. Nicole just finished reading as well. And we both agreed it was really helpful. Like, this guy, basically, it's kind of a travel log type style. And he goes around the world and he tells his stories of meeting with different believers in different situations and the challenges that they're facing and the way in which they're enduring and continuing to follow Christ and believe that he's worth it. And I think we need this perspective. So, yes, things can be hard. We can cry, we can lament. But we also need to gain perspective, and by God's grace, he's going to strengthen us, our kind of endurance muscles, our suffering muscles that might be rather atrophied and weak here in America. And he's going to strengthen those through these experiences. And I believe he can begin to do that as we gain perspective from his word, from other believers, from church history, and so on. So hope that's helpful. But I'd recommend finding some way to get into church history, maybe some biographies, even looking back at Scripture like that, or maybe looking at something like this book, A Company of Heroes, or thinking about the global church and what it's like to be a Christian in other places. So encourage you to pursue some resources like that. I may try to point some out too, but love you guys, and hope you have a great day. Bye.